Hello, my name is Isaac Tamlin. I'm a staff scientist at the National Research Council of Canada, and today I'm going to be talking about some of the work that's been going on within my group and with collaborators trying to apply and improve methodologies that have been developed in deep learning. And in particular, we're trying to figure out how we can kind of overcome some of the gaps that have started to emerge as we apply these in new domains. I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank the organizers of this session for inviting me to give a presentation, and as well to everybody who came together and overcame all the logistical challenges involved in quickly turning this into a virtual meeting. So thanks very much to everyone involved. Now, to get going, I think I want to start with a very simple question. Simple to a human, we'll say. And the question is this. So suppose that I give you a picture where you can see these two dots that are sitting on the screen right now. And I ask the question, how close are these two particles? Well, for a human, the first thing you do is you go and you find a ruler or some way, a meter stick. I guess I'm back in Canada as I'm recording this right now, so we're allowed to use meters. And you would sort of take your meter stick and you'd put it up against the wall there, and you'd put it next to maybe the center of the two particles, and you'd read off the distance on your meter stick, and you would come up with some number, right? So you would sort of, if you think about the process that's involved with that, you have been trained to pick up on the features. You know what a particle is. You have a concept of a distance, and you have some way to scale it off. So this is something that we can teach children to do, and is part of everyone's sort of science education. But I want to kind of ask the same question of, well, what about if we're not trying to get a human answer for this? What if I wanted to solve the problem with a machine through machine learning? So how would we go about doing this? Well, first off, let's think on sort of maybe some not necessarily obviously connected problem, but if you'll bear with me, you'll see how things can come together. So the MNIST training set is sort of the prototypical training set that everyone first plays with when they start doing things with computer vision. If you're not familiar with what it is it's a large amount of data that was put together through NIST, which is sort of a sister organization to the place that I work at, where if you want to go get thousands of copies of the handwritten number 1 and thousands of copies of handwritten number 3, you can go do that. So basically what they did is they scanned in a number of images taken from sort of standardized tests and by kids and people in the military, and they painstakingly scanned them in and applied labels to them. So I can give you an example of what I mean by that. So take here as an example of an MNIST digit of the number 5. You can go and you can download this, and what you're going to get is a grid of numbers. So it's typically 28 by 28 pixels, and each one of those pixels is represented by a number that goes between 0 to 255 grayscale. So 0 means black, 255 means white. And if you solve the sort of the handwritten OCR problem, the way that you do this with ML, or machine learning rather, is we want to build a box that has the following properties. So if I show it this data file of the number 5, if I feed it to the box, what I want the box to return to me is what's called here on the right this one-hot vector. So why is this the correct label? Well, because if you read from the top, you can see that it goes 0. It's not a 0, it's not a 1, it's not a 2, a 3, a 4, but yes, it is a 5. So if I show it a picture of 5, then I should get this vector. If I show it a picture of a 7, then I should get this vector, a 0 like this. And of course, I don't just want to train on one particular instantiation of the handwritten digit. If I were to show it a different 0 written down by another person or another person, it should give me the same result. And as we know, the way that this is achieved is basically through a series of labeled data. So this was the painstaking labeling process that took place by staff at NIST. Actually, I'm not sure it was staff. This sort of sounds like I imagine that there was some poor summer student who probably got this task. But thank you to the summer students everywhere. So there are many ways that you can build this box, but one of the ways that I would say kind of really took off, and it has now become sort of very much standard, is something called a convolutional neural network. So a convolutional neural network is a class of network topology which relies on convolutional operators. So here, this is an example taken from a paper in '98 by some names which are pretty familiar these days, having recently won the Turing Prize. And you can see that, so the input in this case is the handwritten digit 8, and what you're showing is that there, or A rather, and you can see that there are these convolutions which are sort of masking over the image. Each one creates a channel. In this particular case, there's sort of some sampling moves that happen and pooling layers within the channels. But then finally, the output is this idea of one-hot vectors. And so if you're not familiar with what a convolution looks like, the wonderful thing about deep learning and AI is that people have this great community of sharing. And so here's an example of what it looks like I just sort of found on the internet. So here's what a convolution looks like. It's really just a mask which is applied over a set of data, and then simple element by element addition. So suppose on the far left hand side this is your data, and I want to apply this kernel in this case, which is a kernel of size 3 by 3, and you can see that there's two non-zero elements at the top left and the bottom right, the 4 and the -4. What I do if I want to take a convolution of that left-hand matrix with this kernel, I'm going to go apply it as a mask, and I do element by element multiplication. You can see that I've done it there for us out on the right-hand side. So I sum these things up, I get the number 8, and then I want to take some stride over with the kernel and do the exact same operation. So to go back to our problem here, how close are these particles? The question I want to sort of start with is, can we train something like a convolutional net to, figure out the distance, right? So rather than showing the number 5, what if I show it some pictures of some particles? And rather than a one-hot value, what I'm going to output is the scalar value of the distance between the particles. And so, of course, to do this, we need to have some labeled data. So here's another image that we can provide it, and another, and another, and another. And it turns out that if you go through and you produce a number of these images and you train it, you can produce some predictions now for pictures that you haven't seen, and you can assess this. So here what we're plotting is predicted versus true. So on the y-axis, this is the predicted, the output value of the model, the neural net once it's been trained, and we're comparing that against the true distance. So the sort of the value that a human would measure, or that we actually use to synthesize the data. And the fact that all of the data lies on the line y equals x is quite good. So this at this point says, okay, very good. We're doing a really good job with our model. And so if I were to sort of end the presentation at this point, you might walk away and say, fantastic, convnets are great at calculating distances. I'm not clear why you would want to do it. It's a pretty inefficient thing to do. But you shouldn't go leave the YouTube channel right now, because I would be remiss if I didn't say, well, wait a minute, what if we push the boundaries of this thing a little bit? So if we take the exact same model and the exact same training protocol rather, and the exact same type of data, but we forget to include all of the distances. Suppose that we only show it pictures where the distance goes between 1 or 2, and we train a model on that and test it outside of that, so distances between 2 to 3, where you look at extrapolating, you can see that suddenly there's this huge problem. So on the regime of distances that we actually trained our model on, we get excellent performance, and you can actually see that there's, on the inset there's a histogram. This is showing how many instances of particular distances we trained our model on. So there's many examples, an even distribution between 1 or 2, but then there's no examples between 2 to 3. We get this very alarming prediction now from our model, where it has completely failed to predict distances anything past 2, which is, if you think about it, if I were to sort of stand in front of you and say, this is a distance of 1.3, and this is an example of 1.75 and 1.6 and so on, and you got really, really good at that, a human or a more intelligent algorithm, if you showed it something that was slightly larger at 2.5, it would get the pattern. But clearly something has gone awry in what we've done here. The story with interpolation is a little bit better, but it's still not particularly good. So now what we're doing is we're holding out data for the middle distances, and you can see that there's somehow it lands between the two of them, but the spread is quite huge. The problems are particularly pronounced if we use, rather than something like a distance, if we get a little bit more sophisticated and we say, suppose that there's, rather than a distance between two particles, suppose that they have some interaction energy. So we use the familiar Leonard-Jones potential just as an example. And if you train a model on certain distances, say in this example, in our simple Leonard-Jones example, a distance of a effective something like 1 to 1.25, and for a given set of parameters, you're sampling kind of the bottom of the well. Again, the model does extremely well for over the distance and energy range that it's seen before, but it has terrible properties for extrapolation. This is completely imphysical. And a similar story is true with interpolation. And to be clear, I don't want to sort of set off alarm bells here. There are ways that you can improve this. We've sort of set this up as a worst case scenario in terms of our use. You can improve these things with regularization. You can improve these things with sort of like, rather than doing just a straight up regression by going for a correction, but sort of by default out of the box, this is a problem that exists. And it's a known problem within the field. And so the question that I kind of want to address in just the general sense is, how do we overcome these gaps? How do we actually do extrapolation? How do we do reliable interpolation? And how do we transfer the knowledge that we're getting from some length scales and apply them to the other ones? This is the type of work that we're trying to solve right now within my group. And so I'm going to give you some, so that was sort of some older an older paper where we sort of explored and discovered this problem, or rediscovered it really for ourselves. And now I'm going to show you some more recent stuff where we're actually trying to fix it. So the first thing I want to do is sort of flip gears a little bit and show you some pictures of some people. And so what I want you to do is take a moment, have a look at the pictures that are in front of you, and I want you to try and find the 2 people from this list that are real people. So 2 of these pictures are real, and the rest are false. So can you find the 2? So give yourself a minute. Pause it if you have to. Take as long as you want. Okay, right. So a lot of people tend to think that the guy on the bottom right is real, and that the kid on the bottom left is real. And to be honest, those were the 2 that I chose. But turns out none of them are real. Yeah, so I've used this joke in presentations a few times now. I'm getting worried that word is going to get out that no one is ever real. So at some point I'm going to have to update this slide. But what these are is they're the output of something called a generative adversarial network. And so these, a GAN, as it has become to be called, they were invented by someone named Ian Goodfellow back in 2014. And if you followed the field, there's been an absolutely huge amount of sort of effort and developments in GANs that took what was a wonderful idea in 2014 and have turned them into to something that's pretty astonishing. And so sort of inspired by that, we in this next project that I'm going to talk to you about, we said, well, maybe we can apply maybe we can sort of modify a GAN in a particular way, adapt it to our problem, and help sort of solve this problem of extrapolation and interpolation. And so we came up with a new topology, which we coined it a RuGAN. So RuGAN means regressive in the sense that it can operate on sort of scalar values. Upscaling is something that we'll hopefully understand in the next couple of slides. And then of course the root is the GAN. And so this work is, I've listed the archive list here. And actually there's another talk that happens in a different session. So for more information about the RuGAN, I would say check out the work by Cornel. So he was the lead author on the paper. But I'll give you a quick little preview here on what we did with the RuGAN. So basically, what happens with the RuGAN for the people that are sort of a bit more technical is that it is a what do I want to say here? Conditional GAN, where we've adapted the output layer so that it's a regressive, so it can operate as a scalar, and then we've also modified the padding so that we can handle boundary conditions a little bit differently. And we're also using the Wasserstein distance here. And what we've applied it to, just as an example, there was a wonderful set of data that was published online and released, or published rather, in Science last year. And what was really great about it was not only did they do great science with it, they actually they shared all the data set from it. And so that's thanks very much for that, because it was able to really enable our project. And so very briefly, what happened in that paper is they did something which is called an optical lattice. So an optical lattice sets up with a series of lasers an environment where you can have sort of local potentials, we'll say, that can trap atoms, and the atoms can form sort of a pattern within the potential energy surface. They can form interactions with one another, and what you end up with is something that is an atomic scale wave function of these interacting particles. So in this example, you can see that there's lithium atoms, and of course, once you have once these interactions form and you actually have a quantum superposition, you can take measurements of them, and then what you will start to get out from this are a series of sort of observations of the different eigenstates of the system. And so what we're showing here are, so these are the data that were collected in these experiments, and these are sort of the different observations that you would get of all the different patterns that these particular atoms would form. And so in this initial paper, what they did is not only did they sort of show the experimental results, but they actually then developed and compared it with some different types of theory to try and sort of explain some, we'll say, numbers that can be extracted from these, or observables rather, that can be extracted from the different observations. And so I won't go through these in detail. I direct you to Cornel's talk, but what we did with the Rugan was we said, well, can we actually sort of try this holdout thing with a Rugan? Can you train with some data on the left-hand side? So what we're plotting here, this doping parameter basically gives you the concentration of the different lithium atoms within the lattice. But what we do is we train the Rugan on these images that I showed you back here. And so this is now the input to the Rugan, and we condition it on the doping parameter. So we're giving it not just the image, but also what the doping number was within the system. And in the same way that we do sort of the holdout type experiments for the distance between the two atoms, we're going to do now the same thing with the Rugan. So for values between 0 and 0.1, we're going to actually give it access to the experimental data and to the doping parameter. And then for values that are greater than about 2.6, we do the same thing. And we're going to use the Rugan now to try and interpolate between the two of them. And so you can see that, so the blue is the output of the Rugan. And to be clear, we're not interpolating on this graph. What we're actually doing is a Rugan is going to create synthetic data of the same sort of shape and size that you get from the experiment, and then we run it through the exact same processing routine to calculate what are called these average string lengths. And you can see a depiction of what a string length is right here. So it really is like operating on synthetic data. And when you do this, the Rugan actually has pretty good interpolation abilities. So for this particular observable, the string length, I would say it's kind of a wash as to whether or not the Rugan is better than the kind of, we'll say, in this case, analytic string theory is what we have plotted here. Both of them sort of do a pretty decent job. There's more of a deviation once you get to the high doping regime between the experiment and the analytic seam theory. But if you were to look at it this way, and I tried to tell you that the blue curve is massively better than the green curve, you should sort of question that. But we'll call it a wash in this particular case. But now if you start to look at the correlation function, so other observables that you can calculate, things become much more striking. So another sort of phenomenological or sort of analytical, I guess is a better way of describing it, theories to explain the correlations within the Rugan called sprinkled holes and geometric strings. You can see that there's actually very large deviation between what was observed experimentally and what the prediction from these methods are here. Whereas for the Rugan, which again, we're not interpolating on this curve, but we're actually generating the data and then calculating explicitly the correlation functions, you can see that there's excellent agreement between the Rugan all through the, or rather, there's excellent agreement in the extrapolation regime, which is the shaded region on the right, both for the 1 and the 2 particle correlation functions. Finally, the thing that I wanted to highlight here is that because of this new topology that we've developed, you can actually use the Rugan to generate structures at much larger size. So you can sort of synthesize larger scale experiments. And these are the results that we have here. So currently, there's limitations of the field of view that you can use for an optical lattice. And so the largest scale image that you could get is sort of limited. But what we did in this paper, and you can hear about in Cornel's talk, is we actually trained on a small field of view, but then made predictions for a much larger scale of view. So please check that out. Okay, The next thing I want to talk about in terms of overcoming gaps is let's take this sort of to the extreme. So in this case, we were sort of talking about interpolation and extrapolation where we have these holdouts, but there's still a number of experiments going on, right? So in the first case, we were sort of saying, well, you get to see a variety of distances, or you get to, in the second case, we said you get to see a variety of doping parameters. My question that now I want to ask is, well, what can you actually predict if you only have access to a single experiment? So imagine that it's the first day of graduate school and you go to your advisor and you say, okay, great, I'm ready to do my experiments. I'm excited, I've got my lab notebook here. And you go to your advisor and she says, okay, well, you need to choose a single set of conditions to take all of your observations. And then you need to write your entire thesis and prediction based on that single set of conditions. This would be very daunting, right? So is that a possible thing to do? Is your advisor, is she sending you off a cliff, or is there some hope? So what's the experiment that we're going to do? Well, we're going to focus on a really simple experiment. So let's suppose that you have something like a paper clip. Okay, so what do we know about paper clips? So paper clips are fun to play with, especially when you're a kid, if you have a magnet, right? So if I have some paper clips and I have some magnet, as I lift up the magnet, the paper clip sticks to it. Pretty much every kid has discovered this in some way. And then the lucky kids, they start to say, well, wait a minute, maybe I can sort of play around a little bit more but with this thing, and I'm going to start to rub my paper clip on my magnet. And if you're wondering, was this difficult to do in PowerPoint, these little animations, the answer is yes, took way longer than I thought it would. But, for science, let's do it. So now we have this magnetized paperclip, right? And we can do our next little thing. And what do we find? We find that we can magnetize the paperclip, and it can play something out. And typically, when people ask you how do magnets work, this is the thing that you do, right? So you take the demagnetized thing, you push it against the magnet, and you say, okay, there's these little domains, and now they're all pointing in the same way, and now it's magnetized. And the little kid looks at you and says, I'm not sure you've explained magnetism, but you kind of, at this point, hand them the paper clips and run away. Okay, there's a second experiment that you should do with that kid before you run away, which is, and at this point you will sort of distract them, you say, well, let's get a blowtorch. So once you have your magnetized paper clips and you take a blowtorch, something very interesting happens, which is you get demagnetization. So why does this happen, and how hot does it need to be? If you sort of go back to kind of first year statistical mechanics, we can think about this in terms of there's a phase transition that's happening. It's a continuous phase transition that goes between the spontaneously magnetic and non-magnetic phase. And so how shall we think about this? This is the experiment now, the one experiment that we get to do. So typically the way that you would sort of think about the domains within your system is that at thermal equilibrium, they're sort of flipping between these different microstates. So I'm using sort of time here very much in brackets in the sense that it's not time that I'm talking about, it's an MDP, so there is no memory between state to state. But at constant conditions, so mole in the canonical ensemble, so N, V, and T, what you have at thermal equilibrium is that the system is sort of flipping through these different microstates, and so this is true for sort of spins, molecules, or optical lattices, or whatever. And you can kind of, to understand the system, I know that if I apply a magnetic field to it, I can induce a net magnetism in one direction, and if I were to apply the opposite field in another direction, I'll get this sort of the opposite effect. And then if I turn up the temperature a little bit, then I can start to get some small fluctuations, but still I have a net magnetic sort of locked in within the system. All the domains are pointing in the same direction. And then at higher temperature, you start to get sort of more of these fluctuations that are happening. And there, of course, is this critical temperature at which point you can no longer have a locked-in magnetic field. Okay, so that's the experiment we get to do. We get to observe the microstates of our system, and we can take as many observations as we want, but we only get to choose one temperature at which the experiment happens. So how much can you do with that? Well, rather than sort of thinking about it in terms of white and black squares or up-down spins, let's think about it as a sequence of numbers. So here I have my grid, so 1 means spin up, -1 means spin down. And we're going to do something a little bit different, which is I'm going to take this data and I'm going to draw a pretty picture on it. So imagine sort of choose one of these spins and draw a spiral around it. It turns out that the way that you draw this spiral doesn't seem to really matter that much. We've drawn snakes as well, but let's just stick with a spiral right now. So you have this data. I choose a spin, and I'm going to draw this spiral around it. So long as everything is done consistently, then you're good to go. So if I take this spiral and now I want to unwrap it. So imagine unwrapping the spiral. What do I get? I go from a 2D matrix of ones and minus ones to something that looks like an actual sequence of one, minus one, 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 minus one, one, one. And there's going to be some pattern. So each microstate is going to have a different sequence associated with it. And what do we know about sequences? So imagine that I give you this sentence, the chicken, or la poule, if you're sitting in Quebec. What immediately comes to mind? Well, what comes to mind is the rest of the sentence, which is cross the road. Humans, we've picked up on the sequences. We've started to see patterns or examples in previous life where when you start a sequence, we can start to guess what happens later in the sequence. This is something that, if you've got an Android phone or an Apple phone where it starts to do sort of those funny suggestions on how you should respond in your email, or maybe it does the prediction of the next words in the sentence. Think this kind of way. Well, how do those things actually work? There's a couple ways that you can do it. So probably the most common method these days is a transformer. But the one that we use right now in this project is called a recurrent neural network. So a recurrent neural network is a class of neural network, which I'm showing you here, where the output of the net feeds back in, or a portion of the output of the net feeds back in every time that you call it. That's why it's called recurrent. Recurrent neural networks are good at understanding and predicting the properties of sequences. So let's just sort of hold that in our minds for a minute. Now, what do we know about sort of classical statistical physics? We have the expression for the probability of some microstate appearing when you are at thermal equilibrium is given by the following expression. So e to the negative beta h of sigma I. So h of sigma I just means what is the energy of that microstate, and beta is the inverse temperature, divided by z, which is the partition function. So this is kind of first year stat mech. And if you say, so that's the probability of a single microstate showing up at thermal equilibrium. And what's the probability, or the relative probability, of another one? So you just choose some other microstate. You can have an exact same expression, but we just change what the subscripts are. And if I take the ratio of those two things, you'll believe me that I can pretty quickly solve for the energy difference, so delta EI, between the two microstates. It's just given as log of the two probabilities multiplied by beta 0, which is the observation temperature, so beta 0 to the minus 1. Okay. So what can we do by linking these ideas? So the ideas that we get from sort of statistical mechanics from recurrent neural networks, and that's what we've done in this project. So let's take a particular microstate. We're going to apply this unwrapping idea. We're going to turn it into a sequence, and then what we want to do is we're going to train recurrent neural nets on different lengths of those sequences. So then the net will start to learn how to predict the next spin in the sequence. And so why is that useful? Because once you have a trained net, once it has learned the pattern of the sequences that it actually sees at that fixed temperature, you can give it a new sequence, and you can start to key in that new sequence of different lengths. So if it was, say, something like 1, 1, you can feed that into your recurrent net, and the net will tell you, if you seed it in with a 1, the net will say, what's the probability of the next one being a 1 or a minus 1? And then we're going to write down that number. And so then you say, okay, cool. Now I'm going to take a string of the next length, which is 1, 1, minus 1. So we write that down. We say, given an observation of 1, 1, minus 1, what's the probability of the next one being a 1 or a minus 1? And if you keep track of all of those probabilities and multiply them through as a conditional probability, you can get an estimate for the total probability of that whole microstate. Now, if you take a second microstate, so sigma j in this example, and go through the exact same procedure where you recursively, or not, sorry, not recursively, where you multiply through the conditional probabilities of string lengths which increase. So you have to do it many, many, many times. You can get an estimate for that probability of the sigma j. Taking the ratio of the two now gives you an estimate for the delta E, the energy difference between the two microstates. So here's now a plot of the estimates that this RNN model, as we call it, gives you between different microstate energies. So it's predicted versus true. So that's pretty cool in of itself. If you think about it, you've never given any form of the net any idea about what the energy of the system is. All you've seen is a whole bunch of observations of different microstates, and all you know is that they were collected at the same temperature. But then using a recurrent neural network, you can kind of pick up the pattern. You can learn the probability, the conditional probabilities of different parts, multiply them through and get a total probability, and now you have an energy estimate. What can you do with an energy estimate between different microstates? Well, you can do Metropolis Monte Carlo sampling of this to start making predictions for behavior. So in this next plot, here what we're showing is magnetization as a function of temperature, which is sort of, and where we've calculated it with Monte Carlo. And so the black curve is the prediction that you would get. So if you sort of just wrote a function in your code in Python, which evaluated the energy between all the spins. This is sort of like if you've ever done kind of like a numerical computing course and people teaching about Monte Carlo, this is a homework assignment that they will give you. And so the black curve is what you get for a whole bunch of different temperatures. This is all for the ferromagnetic Ising model with a coupling of J equals 1. The black curve is what you get if you sort of run it the standard way, and you can get, as expected, there's a turnover at the Curie temperature. But then the red curve, the little red dots rather, these are also MC simulations, but where we've used our recurrent neural network to calculate the energy difference. The vertical line, though, is the observation temperature where we actually trained our model. So the RNN was fully trained only on data that it saw at value of kBt equal to 4. So you only see pictures, ones and minus ones, and I tell you one number, which is you observed it at a temperature of T. And by learning the RNN energy model, we have an estimate of the Hamiltonian that we can then plug into existing machinery to predict the properties under all other temperature conditions. So when we apply a flame, we can get an estimate. So at that point, you would say, maybe we're done. Okay, let's add another branch to this. So far, we talked about starting on this sort of matrix, the ones and minus ones. We do the unwrap. We get the estimates for the probability. We take ratios of the two or compare it to a reference to get a value for delta E. Now let's add a second branch to this workflow. I'm going to take the exact same configuration, but I'm going to feed it into a feed-forward net, and I'm going to train the feed-forward net on those labels. And the particular type of feed-forward net that I'm going to use is something that we call an EDNN. So an EDNN is something that we published last year in Chemical Science, and I've got a link to the DOI there. So what is an EDNN? An EDNN is what we call an extensive deep neural network, and it's a topology which we designed so that it can learn extensive properties. So an extensive property is anything that sums over subsystems, so something like magnetization, energy, entropy, these kinds of things. How does it work? Imagine that you have some binary sequence. It doesn't, just as an example, so the ones and zeros. With an EDNN, there are two hyperparameters which are called focus and context. So focus, you can see that there's these sort of red and orange and green little cells here. Focus is a number which sort of relates to how well parallelized the system can be. Ideally, you would have a focus of 1 in a system, but it turns out to be quite computationally heavy to use that, and so this is sort of an adjustable parameter. which is a balance between sort of parallelizability and how much upfront training cost you have. Probably, I would say, the more important parameter, though, is the second one here, which is called context. Context is the amount of information around each focus that you need in order to estimate the operator. So magnetization is something which is fully local, and so I only need to focus on one spin to say what the contribution to the magnetization of that one spin is. So magnetization has a context of 0, or you need a context of 0 for magnetization. And if you have something like an Ising Hamiltonian, your context is going to be 1. I need to know what the neighborhood of spins around me is doing. And if you're operating in some electronic structure method, like in a material, the context needs to be on the order of the screening length within your material. And so what you do is to take an EDNN, you take your raw data, you take, for around each foci, you pad and you're replicating a context amount. So you can see the red, the orange, the blue, and the green here. And then, so some of the data is replicated, so you have overlapping regions within context. And then we create a feed-forward net where we have these different paths, these different subnets. So there's the red, the orange, the blue, and so forth. But the weights of each one of them are locked to be identical. So we feed all of the data in. You can either do it in parallel or serial. It doesn't actually matter. Through all of them simultaneously, they come to a final connected layer, and then they output the losses against your extensive value, and then we do backprop through each one of these different subnets at the same time. And when you've trained an EDNN, you can, through hyperparameter optimization, learn the locality length scale of your operator. So in this case, we already know it ahead of time, so we're going to use a value of 1. But once you have learned that locality length scale, you can now break your problem up exactly into subcomponents of that. And so what we did is we said, well, let's take an EDNN and we're going to do sort of synthetic experiments on one length scale, so 8 by 8 spin models, but we are going to train our EDNN with labels that came from the RNN. And so then we take our EDNN and then we apply it to now larger scale spin models. So on the left, you can see the EDNN performance of that model relative to the RNN model upon which it was trained, and the agreement is very good. But now we can actually do Monte Carlo simulations on a length scale that we hadn't even observed. So I don't have an observation temperature listed here because we never saw any properties of the larger scale system. All of our training was done at a single temperature on a small scale system, and using this method, so we call it distribution consistent learning in the paper, so linking these two ideas, we are able to develop a machinery which can fully predict the properties at unseen length scales and across all temperature scales. Moreover, what I find particularly exciting about this is if you take these two models, the RNN model and the EDNN model, and you compare it against the ground truth energies, naively, and by naively I mean I would have thought, well, the RNN will probably do a better job because it was sort of closer in some sense to the labels, right? So the RNN gave the probabilities, then I do ratios to get energies, and so I would have thought that the error, so we're doing now the error in the model minus the value of the model compared to the actual ground truth, I thought the RNNs would actually come closer. It turns out the EDNN actually has a better estimate. It's closer to ground truth than the RNN, even though it itself was trained on the RNN. And so why is it? The answer is actually kind of, if you think about it, there's more physics in an EDNN. EDNNs are based on this idea that there is some locality length scale of operators, that sort of things are not sort of, you don't have infinite distance interactions, and that sort of requirement of the that sort of physical law is the same, is embedded into the concept of an EDNN. So to put it simply, more physics equals better predictions. we've taken this system and we've applied it. Everything I've talked about at this point with DCL has been applied. I've been talking about sort of Ising models. We've also in the paper looked at Potts models and gone for a much more challenging system, which is a spin glass. So in the spin glass system, we have completely disordered interactions. So it's random IJ coupling between spins. Again, we have the same type of thing where we observe at one temperature. We can train a model, and then we can use that learned Hamiltonian with normal sampling methods, Metropolis, to make predictions for the energy across the entire range of conditions. Now, of course, with a spin glass, things can get a little bit more complicated in the sense that, as you cool a spin glass, the rate of cooling can matter. So I want to take this sort of opportunity to give a quick shout out. We've actually started to think about this problem of cooling, of sort of annealing systems. How can you sort of use ML methods to solve this problems? And so we have a paper that we've just submitted and put up on the archive, which addresses that problem, which is imagine you have a system of interacting particles and you say, how do I find the ground state? How do I choose some cooling protocol to find the ground state using machine learning? And so in that paper, what we did is we said, well, if you think about it, this is kind of like a game. I have some control system. I know I can define success. Perhaps reinforcement learning is a way of approaching this problem. And so you should check out the archive. I was teasing Kyle Mills, the graduate student who was the lead author on this paper and did some excellent work. I'm not clear. He also made the graphic. I'm not clear whether or not we use more GPU time on the render of the project or on the actual project. But yeah, you can check that out there. Okay, so thanks very much for sticking around. I just wanted to really say again that this work was a great effort by a wonderful team. So we've got some really wonderful students and collaborators that I've had a wonderful pleasure with working with. If you're interested in sort of seeing more of the results that this great team did, I was the lucky person that gets to actually present it, but these are the real people that did the work here. Please sort of check out the website. You can see our data sets and you can get access to the code to try these things out. So thanks very much, and I look forward to seeing everybody else's talks.